Hello, everyone, and welcome. Thank you so much for coming to my non-conventional NCA presentation today and joining me here in my dining room instead of in Indianapolis. I want to begin by saying how much I really appreciate everyone who's taking the time to view this video and pay attention to my work. This article has been in the works for a whole long time. It's taken a good chunk of effort to get it to this stage. And so I also appreciate any comments that you might have, and I'm always happy to share the full paper if you have questions beyond what I cover in this presentation. Today I'm going to talk about my work, Fighting Equal Manhood Rhetorics with the White Woman Citizen, the National Women's Suffrage Association's Declaration of the Rights of Women of the United States, as it came at the end of Reconstruction. I'm Dr. Meredith Steyer, and thank you so much for joining me today. So this really began for me when I learned that the Declaration of Women's Rights that I was familiar with from Seneca Falls in 1848 was not the only declaration of women's rights in the 19th century. In fact, there were two. And the second comes at the Centennial celebration, 1876, the 100th birthday of the American nation, or so they called it at the time. And it's very, very different. The document is much more dour. It has far less of the ringing equality of the Declaration of Independence and a lot more of the womanhood rationale that we become familiar with and that Bonnie Dow has named from the latter half of the 19th century and the first half of the 20th century. And this really spurred me to ask the question, if we see women's suffrage really losing all traction, losing what Faye Dunn has called their moment of opportunity or their fighting chance at the end of Reconstruction, what happens rhetorically when equality loses? And that's what spurred me to engage with this paper. My thesis here is that the 1876 Declarations of the Rights of Women of the United States demonstrates how, in response to the Reconstruction definition of equality as specifically gendered, that is, equal manhood, the NWSA, the organization headed by Elizabeth Cady Stanton here, and of course Susan B. Anthony, shifted from a rhetoric of Enlightenment equality to a rhetoric of civilization and morality as their justification for women's rights. To engage with this thesis, I look at primary source texts from the Centennial celebration as context, from congressional argumentation, especially surrounding the attempted passage of the Voting Rights and Civil Rights Acts in 1873 and 1875, and the actual declaration itself. So come on, join me and jump on in. Let's begin by setting the stage and talk a little bit about the context of 1876 and this moment at the end of Reconstruction. So there are a few important things to remember. The Minor Happersett case has been decided by the Supreme Court in favor of gender inequality. The Beecher-Tilton scandal has come up and has really decimated the ethos of the women's rights activists. The NWSA and the AWSA, that is the two organizations which had previously been the American Equal Rights Association, had fractured over the inclusion of male in the 14th and 15th Amendments, or in the 15th Amendment specifically. And Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton begin working with their national organization as opposed to the American suffrage organization, really pushing for a much more radical and voting-centric approach. They really doubled down on equality arguments during the late 60s and early 70s. But after Anthony's arrest for voting and the failure of what gets called the New Departure strategy, they have completely failed to gain national attention for their cause. And they are losing support on the political stage as well as in public opinion. And that brings us to the Centennial, a moment when American rhetoric is really seeking stability. Now, don't get it twisted here. There is no stability. This is the end of Reconstruction, one of the most tumultuous periods in American history, but the rhetoric is all about stability and reunion. For instance, some quotations from members of the cabinet, the presidential appointed cabinet that set up the Centennial celebration. They say, the Centennial celebration should do its share in cementing the reunion of the northern and southern states. It's a pretty big ask for a fair. It will tell of a nationality won, of a republic vindicated, of long years of peace. Obviously not a reflection of a reality, an aspirational rhetoric of the stability they sought. When internal strife arose from the only blot in our civilization, it will register the history of a people redeemed, reunited, and henceforth without a motive for discord. All that, lynching, voter suppression, women's rights, Indian wars, all those things that are going on in the mid-70s, those have no motive for discord. We are a stable and united people, I promise. Please believe us. The rhetoric is all about stability and reunion, perhaps best exemplified by the comment from the president of the Centennial Commission. It has been the fervent hope of this commission that people from all states and sections, of all creeds and churches, all parties and classes, burying all resentments, could come together to the birthplace of our liberties and join hands in perfect fraternity. Stability is the name of the game, and manhood is the rhetoric that's going to bring it together. Spoiler alert, the stability was all a lie. Instead, the nation was dealing with massive conflict. And the illusion of stability had to come from somewhere. We were not at a place as a nation that we would actually accept equality. We were not at a place as a nation where we could actually forgive our presentiments and resentments. Instead, the rhetorical tactic used by both black and white male rhetors, both in activist and political circles, was a vocal rhetoric of equal manhood as the justification for equality. For instance, Republican Congressman Daniel Pratt, he was a white congressman from the North, in defending black male equality said, "Forget the color of his skin, the difference between you and the Democrats, and let him disappear." He is focusing here on manhood. It is the equal manhood of the man that defends his equality. In praising physical equality, Pratt said, "He has all the bodily facilities in the fullness perfection, the same capacity to subdue nature, supply his wants, the same appetites. He is not warmed by the same, is he not warmed by the same sun? Does he not breathe the same air?" It is a very physical, embodied, masculine equality that Daniel Pratt defends. In another example, we see a white Republican congressman and former Union General Benjamin F. Butler. He's speaking about why he sought equal laws. And he says, "I want laws enacted, constitutions framed, societies organized so that the Negro shall have a fair chance with the rest. And if he can beat me," again, the physical embodied rhetoric here, "so much the better for him. And if I can beat him, so much the better for me." While speaking again about black congressional colleagues, a black congressional colleague's speech, Butler says, "His speech shows him to be the peer of any man on this floor, be he who he may." It is the embodied physicality of the black male body on the Congress floor giving a speech that entitles this person to equality. Any feminist scholar or any scholar of public address is going to recognize that this becomes a problem for the embodied female rhetor. But that embodiment also presents a potential problem for black male rhetors, especially in a society that is deeply fearful of the imagined black brute, the male black person who is a threat to white femininity and womanhood. And that means that we can see that this manhood rhetoric isn't just a rhetoric or a incident of an old-fashioned linguistic system. It is, in fact, a choice. And there's no better representative of that than John Lynch. He is a black congressman elected from Mississippi. And he really demonstrates that these assertions are not incidental if you compare his discourse about the Voting Rights Act with his discourse about the Civil Rights Act. And that's really where this quotation comes from. John Lynch sought to allay fears surrounding the specter of what's called social equality. That is, the social mixing and potential sexual intercourse of Black men with white women. He uses this favorite Republican euphemism for race mixing through sexual intercourse of social equality. And whenever he addresses social equality, he says that people, persons, races, and classes ought to have civil equality, but could still maintain their social differences. And he really focuses there on pulling it away from that frightening specter of Black masculinity and uses the more general and more modern sounding people, persons, races, classes, groups language instead of the specific and conscious choice to use languages of Black masculinity and masculine embodied equality when arguing for civil rights. So what then of the women's rights movement? This is really the question that spurred me to this project. The previous work has all been sort of the context to understand how prevalent this discourse of masculinity was and what the female rhetors seeking civil rights were up against. So let's transition to the Declaration, written by Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and actually presented at the World's Fair. Susan B. Anthony famously got up on the stage and handed her petition to a member of the Declaration on July 4th in Independence Hall. She actually stormed down the center aisle and interrupted the national hymn of Brazil. I have no idea why they were playing the national hymn of Brazil, but she presented her petition there, then went out front, and while dignitaries inside Independence Hall were hearing the original Declaration of Independence, Anthony read her Declaration of the Rights of Women outside in a pavilion. The problem was nobody covered it. It was shouted down even by women's newspapers, barely covered at all. And this really, to me, was shocking, right? Declaration of war read in Independence Hall. Shouldn't this be a bigger thing? But it wasn't. And so I began wondering why in the world this happened. And so looking at the rhetorical work here and the change in context led me to the following hypothesis. The women's rights movement was a radical northeastern fringe movement before and during the Civil War. But by 12 years after the end of the Civil War, by the end of Reconstruction, it was a national organization stretching from New York to California and across all of the incorporated states and many of the territories. This movement had gained national attention, but it had done so at an extreme cost to the original arguments for equality made in the Declaration from 1848. The nationalization of this crusade was not accomplished without a cost to those equality goals of the original movement. They were radical ideas, the ideas of total human equality. But they were slowly sidelined in favor of more socially acceptable goals of women's inclusion. And this also came with a rhetoric based around more moderate and acceptable social goals. We begin seeing arguments based on morality, education, and civilization, terms that definitionally centered the white, Protestant, married, maternal, middle-class women who were primarily inhabiting the newly nationalized movement. And this rhetoric reflects a change in warranting assumptions, a change from the ideas that all humans should be treated and created equally under the law to an idea of women should have civil rights because they were more moral. The NWSA's declaration really demonstrates this shift in warranting ideas when it's compared to the Enlightenment equality warranting assumptions of the 1848 Declaration. In 1876, there is a strong womanhood rationale that asserted education, morality, and civilization as the markers of women's equality. Educational arguments based around constitutional legal theory are exceptionally prevalent in this document, ones that warrant the assumption that women have access to education that especially immigrants and Black men do not. There's also educational arguments around defining intelligence as white, based in the scientific phrenology that was incredibly popular at the time and that would presage the growth of eugenics as a part of the women's movement in the 20th century. And then finally, the most familiar of these arguments are the morality arguments based on white womanhood that implicate specific middle-class, Protestant Christian motherhood values. This is a really nasty shift, and it is an explicit shift toward arguments of white supremacy as the warranting assumption within the women's rights movement. And I believe that this document demonstrates that in a way that few other documents from the movement do. But I also argue that while this was a nasty and white supremacist shift, it was arguably necessary to achieve the eventual goal of women's enfranchisement, first in Western states, then on local and state level elections, and finally in 1920 nationwide. We can see this in the kind of responses that Susan B. Anthony specifically garnered when she used equality arguments before the end of Reconstruction. There were character attacks on her, a notable one being from a newspaper in Alaska that refused to cover her speech and instead ran an article, or not Alaska, I'm sorry, in Portland, Oregon, that ran an article not covering her speech and instead calling her immoral for being unmarried. The Beecher-Tilton scandal, in which both Anthony and Stanton were implicated, Victoria Woodhull's connection with the suffrage movement, their connection to George Francis Train and his financial dealings, and of course, the NWSA-AWSA split. In contrast, the womanhood arguments brought positive national press attention and coverage from the admittedly white supremacist mainstream press. It brought expansion of the suffrage movement, especially regarding the temperance movement in its close ties to Protestant Christianity. It brought support from anti-immigrant politicians and racist politicians, especially in Western states. And it eventually spurred the kind of financial and organizational success that arguably was central to women's voting rights. This leaves us in a quandary that I haven't figured out how to address yet, that white supremacy was a vital strategy that successfully helped to form the women's rights movement. And that, sad and not very encouraging note, is where I have thus far come with my research. Thank you so much. I love questions. This is a passion project for me, so please engage as much as you want with anything that I've said here, and feel free to request a copy of the paper. My contact information is available on the NCA website or the Georgia College Department of Communication website. Thank you so much for your time and attention.